Okay, let's talk about a time in America when the difference between the super rich and, well, everyone else was just staggering. We're going back to the late 19th century, and things were getting so out of hand that it sparked this incredible revolution. But not with guns and soldiers, nope. This was a revolution of farmers, workers, and journalists who just decided enough is enough. We're going to unpack how their push for change completely reshaped the country.
So after the Gilded Age, which created these unbelievable fortunes, millions of Americans were looking around and feeling like they got a really raw deal. And this wasn't just some quiet grumbling, it was a roar of frustration from people who felt like the whole system was rigged to help the few and leave everyone else behind. That shared feeling, that sense that things were just fundamentally unfair, that was the spark that was about to set off a firestorm of reform.
And this whole story of change really has two main characters. First, you've got the Populists. Think of them as a movement that grew right out of the soil, led by farmers in America's heartland. And then you've got the Progressives, city people, reformers, who picked up the fight in the middle of these new, crowded industrial cities. They came from totally different worlds, but their goal, exactly the same: to fix a system they were convinced was broken.
All right, so the very first group to really start making some serious noise was the Populists. You can think of them as the first stone tossed into a really still pond. They created that initial ripple of change that was eventually going to grow into something much, much bigger.
So you might be wondering, why were the farmers at their breaking point? Well, just imagine being squeezed from every direction. First, the prices you're getting for the crops you worked all year to grow are just tanking. Second, the railroads, your only way to get your stuff to market, are basically monopolies, and they're charging you insane fees. And to top it all off, the country's money is tied to gold, which means there's just not much cash to go around, making the debts you already have almost impossible to pay back. It was a total economic nightmare.
So their solutions were, for the time, pretty radical. To deal with the tight money supply, they pushed for bimetallism, basically adding silver into the money supply to make it easier to get loans and pay off debt. They called for a federal income tax, a crazy idea back then that said, hey, maybe the wealthy should pay a bigger share. To clean up politics, they wanted citizens, not corrupt state legislatures, to elect their senators directly. And they wanted the government to step in and regulate the all-powerful railroads.
Now here's the really interesting part. Their guy, William Jennings Bryan, he lost the big presidential election in 1896. And after that, the Populist Party itself kind of faded away. But, and this is the key takeaway, their ideas? They didn't go anywhere. They had been planted in the American consciousness, just waiting for the right time to sprout. And that ripple the farmers started didn't just disappear. Oh no. It started to build, and it grew into a tidal wave. The fight for the soul of America moved from the farms into the noisy, crowded industrial cities. A whole new generation of reformers picked up the torch, and they called themselves the Progressives. The Progressives had a whole new set of problems they wanted to take on. They went after the corrupt political machines that had a stranglehold on city governments. They exposed the absolutely horrific conditions in factories. We're talking child labor, no safety, the whole deal. They went into the slums and demanded that something be done about the crushing poverty there. And they championed one of the biggest fights of all, the battle for women's right to vote. So how did they get the public to actually care about all this? Well, they had a secret weapon: the muckrakers. These were the investigative journalists of their day. Their job was to dig up all the dirt, the muck, on corporations and politicians and then splash it all over the front pages of magazines for everyone to see. And their stories absolutely shocked the nation into demanding change.
A perfect example is a guy named Upton Sinclair. He wrote a novel called The Jungle, and it was all about the disgusting, stomach-churning reality of the meatpacking industry. I mean, the public was so horrified by what they were reading about that the outcry forced Congress to act. And what was the result? The Food and Drug Administration. Just think about that for a second. A single book led directly to a government agency that still protects our food and medicine today. That's power.
And among all their huge victories, one really stands out. After literally generations of women marching, protesting, and fighting, the Progressives helped achieve what so many thought was impossible: the 19th Amendment. It guaranteed women's right to vote in the Constitution. It was a landmark achievement that truly, fundamentally changed American democracy forever.
So all this pressure, from the muckrakers, the activists, the protesters, and just everyday citizens, it all eventually bubbled up to the highest office in the land. The federal government, and especially the presidents, just couldn't ignore the nationwide call for change any longer. They had to do something. And the presidents definitely responded.
First, you had Theodore Roosevelt, the trust buster, who went to war with corporate monopolies and promised every American a square deal. Then came Woodrow Wilson, who was a bit more like a surgeon. He carefully reformed the banking system, created the Federal Reserve, and passed even stronger laws to break up corporate power. They had different styles for sure, but they were both on the same progressive mission.
So, when you step back and look at this whole era, from the angry farmers to the journalists to the presidents themselves, what's the one big lesson here? What does it all boil down to? It really all comes down to the power of the push.
If there is one single lesson to take away from this entire period, it's this. Americans rediscovered that the government could be a tool for them, not just for the powerful. They proved that when ordinary citizens get together, speak out, and just refuse to give up, they can actually bend the arc of history and force the entire system to deal with the biggest problems in society.
The populists and the progressives, they showed all of us what happens when people decide the system is broken and then push with everything they have to fix it. Which, of course, leaves us with a pretty important question for our own time, doesn't it? What happens when that push stops?